and Yalimadad. My name is Falak Momin, and I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived of as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with the focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical conversations and questions of our time within the context of our faith. I would like to begin by acknowledging that our moderator, Sadat Taylor, was not able to make it today due to unforeseen circumstances, and that Yasmin Karim, one of our panelists, is currently in Gilgit-Baltistan, and she's facing some internet issues, so we hope to have her join as soon as she can. Thank you for bearing with us. I also want to acknowledge that as I moderate the critical conversations today, I do so on the site of the meeting and exchange amongst a number of indigenous peoples, specifically the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Ka'awi, and Wichita nations. I honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to better steward the land that as we inhabit as well. Today we're talking about social justice in Islam, exploring gender inequities. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the concept of what gender is, what Islam says about gender, how inequality sits in gender and impacts many people, and how we can move forward in our own lives as we learn more about gender inequities. During the session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions as we can during the conversation. With that, let me introduce to you our wonderful panelists briefly. I will also be sharing their bios via chat. First, we have Dr. Sunera Thobani. Dr. Thobani is the professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. Her scholarship focuses on critical race, post-colonial and transnational feminist theory, intersectionality and social movements, colonialism, indigeneity and racial violence, globalization, citizenship and migration, representations of Islam and Muslims in South Asian and Western media, Muslim women, Islamophobia, and the war on terror. Our second panelist is Yasmin Karim. Yasmin Karim is from Hunza, Pakistan, and holds a master's degree in gender and development from the Institute of Development Studies, the University of Sussex, UK. She has remained the pioneer in the Karakum region for mountain women as having exposure to education nationally and internationally. Our third and final panelist for today is Dr. Zahra Jamal. Dr. Jamal is an associate director at Rice University's Bonyuk Institute for Religious Tolerance and has consulted on gender, race, and religion for the United Nations, the U.S. Department of State, the Aspen Institute, and the Aga Khan Development Network. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. With that, let's turn to the conversation. So I'd like to begin by asking our first question. What kinds of structural and systemic injustices are there, and how do they affect women today? Dr. Thobani, would you like to get us started?
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a real honor for me to be here with you today. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I live on Coast Salish territories and I work on Musqueam territories. That is where my university is based. So just to acknowledge that I live and work on Indigenous lands and support the whole project of Indigenous sovereignty. So the question you've asked is really important. Structures, institutions, and systems in our society are shaped by power relations, and they affect women in particular kinds of ways, but not all women in the same ways. So one way to think about answering this question is by looking at how the practices of institutions function and what is their impact on women. So feminists who have done this kind of research have found that institutional practices can be identified by three key practices. One is that of stereotyping. And so most institutions have preconceived ideas about what women are like, what women need, what they should be provided with. And so stereotyping works to actually cover over women's actual needs because the institution uses its own preconceptions. The second practice that feminists have identified is that of discrimination. And by this, what feminists mean is that the working of these institutions, their functions, have an uneven and unequal impact on women, and they discriminate against women. So, that is another practice. The third one is marginalization. Because these institutions have their own preconceived ideas of women's roles, gender expectations, they override women's actual voices, women's actual experiences, and impose institutional solutions onto women. And in this way, they disempower women. So that's one way of looking at how institutions work to reproduce women's inequality. Another way is to think about what these institutions actually are. How have they been founded? What do they actually accomplish? What do they do in women's lives? And the feminists who've done this kind of research have found that most institutions are founded from male perspectives. What this means is that they are controlled and run by men, even though women might be serving at administrative levels. The way they've been founded actually embodies a male view of the world, and the practices are actually shaped by gendered practices, by masculine practices. And so feminists argue that these institutions themselves are masculinist, that they are patriarchal. So it's not just in their functions that they discriminate against women, but their very founding reproduces patriarchal power relations, which means that they reproduce gender inequality, they reproduce violence against women, they silence women, and they produce injustices in this gendered way. Then this approach, of course, considers gender to be a social construct. What this means is that feminists make a distinction between sex as nature and gender as cultural, political. And so the argument here is that gender relations are actually produced, they are created by human activity within the social order. And so these institutions, by treating women unequally, actually produce gender across the spectrum of society because these institutions interact with each other, they reinforce gender ideologies. So if we look at, for example, the institution of the family, this is a kind of building block of society. And within the family, we have gender roles, we have gender expectations. Men will be breadwinners, women will be responsible for being homemakers. So we see that there is a gender division of labor within the family. Women are constructed as primarily caregivers, whether it's taking care of children, of elders. So this division of labor devalues women's labor because men work outside the home, they are paid for that work, women work inside the home, but this is seen to be a labor of love. It's not considered to be valuable labor, women are not paid for it. And so there is a kind of inbuilt economic inequality within the gender division of labor in the family. And this then crosses over into the economy, so that when women go out to work into the labor force, our labor is still devalued. Our primary function is seen to be that of mother, wife, daughter. And so economic institutions then also continue this devaluation of women's labor. And of course, this makes women economically more dependent men, more dependent on families. So this is the way in which institutions themselves are patriarchal. A third way to answer the same question is, well, which women are we talking about? Because not all women are impacted in the same way by these institutions. So, there is no universal experience of gender for women. There is no universal woman in that sense. How woman is constructed interacts with race, with ethnicity, with language, nation, religion. These are all also, of course, social constructs. So if we take in Canada, for example, Indigenous women have historically been constructed as quote unquote bad mothers.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Thobani. A wonderful answer. Dr. Jamal, would you like to add anything to this?
No, I think that Sunera did a fantastic job in responding to this question. I just saw in the chat that Yasmin is trying to speak. We just cannot hear her. So I've asked if she can type her answer. And perhaps we can either wait for her, or while she's typing, we can take another question and then go back to her, however you like.
Sounds good. Thank you. I will continue on, and hopefully she can type her answer out. All right. So moving on, let's talk about what the Quran says about gender and women, and maybe some examples of Muslim women who have put what the Quran is saying into practice. Dr. Jamal, would you like to get us started on that?
Sure, happy to. So I think at the outset, it's useful to note that there is no specific term in the Quran for gender or for sexuality. So for example, references to the soul or to mates or partners, these are agendered notions. And so they are open for interpretation, and largely I think because the nature of the soul in reference to God, God is beyond all attributes, beyond male and female. These are things that he's created. Now, the Quran does reference men and women because that is part of this world, and this is a revelation. These are messages for people, and talks about the importance of peace and love and mercy and modesty between them. I think the other piece here that is very important is that the Quran itself guarantees spiritual equality between men and women. So the call to believe, to pray, to do good deeds, to be humble and truthful, and all of these things are equal between men and women from God's perspective of what he has asked us all to do, and also that for which we have to account on the day of judgment. The Quran also grants women specific rights. And it's because at this moment in history, when the Quran is revealed in the 7th century, women don't have social standing. They don't have these rights. And so it grants women rights in family and in society. So for example, in the context of the family, women are given rights to marriage, to decide on their own, rights to divorce, to inheritance, to property, to contracts. And then in a social setting, also rights to education, public speech, etc. And the Quran also outlawed female infanticide and family violence or abuse. And I think what's also interesting here is that these are rights that are guaranteed by God and revealed in the 7th century again. But in Western societies, you see feminists, women and men, advocating for these kinds of rights for women as late as the 19th and 20th centuries, asking for legal rights to be created by people, whereas it is God who has already guaranteed these rights to Muslim women for the previous 1300 years. Also, if you take a look at the Quran, it talks about in the chapter on the women, Surah Al-Nisa, that there is a duty towards God and duty towards the women or the wombs that bore you. In other words, each of us is born of a woman, and we have a specific set of duties to honor and respect those women. I think this also speaks to the fact that, at least from some interpretations of the Quran, that like God, whose womb or rahmah, his compassion and mercy encompasses all of creation and the new soul, it speaks to the exalted status of women who also encompass a new soul, right? When they are carrying a fetus. If you look at Shia interpretations of Islam, there is a special exalted status for women as well, in that women enabled the spread of the message of Islam. So Bibi Khadija aided in that effort, and also in the interpretation of the word. So Bibi Fatima, for example, as the wife of the first Shia Imam and the mother of the next Shia Imam, etc. So, the status of women enabled these God-given duties given to Prophet Muhammad and to the imams to actually occur. I think, some examples here are also useful. So I mentioned Bibi Khadija. So she was able to assert her rights to property and assets. And so these were things that she had acquired on her own through her own business, and therefore had rights to choose over how to use those assets. And she used them to help the poor, for the ransom of slaves, to pay for the weddings of kin, etc. So much so that when she passed away, there was nothing left. So she had used all of her money in the way of faith and in supporting the Prophet's work. Bibi Fatima also, for example, in a public setting, she advocated for justice and stood up for her right to inheritance of a tract of land left for her by her father, Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, and also remained very generous and patient despite her own poverty and suffering in this world. And when she turned to the Prophet asking for having someone to help her with her housework because it was so difficult, his response was, actually, let me give you something even more powerful, which we know today as Bibi Fatima's tasbih. And so to be prayerful in times of difficulty and suffering is something that's also central to the Quranic word. If you fast forward a little bit in history, we also find that the oldest university that exists in the world today was founded in the mid-9th century in Morocco by a Muslim woman. And so I think that's also remarkable, because women's rights to education meant that not only were they acquiring education, but they also enabled its advancement in society for all people and over generations. I think if you fast forward a little bit more, it's also interesting to note that, for example, in the United States, we have not yet had a female president. But if you look at various Muslim countries, they have had Muslim women as heads of state. So, for example, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia. Right? You can also look in the last 10 or 15 years that a number of Nobel Prize winners have been Muslim women. So Malala Yousafzai in education, Tawakkul Karman, who fought for political, social, and economic rights during the Arab Spring in Yemen, and Shirin Ebadi, who is a human rights lawyer in Iran, who was also advocating for women's rights, but also highlighting that women are complicit in the reproduction of patriarchal attitudes and pass them on to their children, and so that this is something that needs to be addressed. And then I think more recently, we've also seen feminist interpretations of the Quran to kind of reclaim opportunities for interpretation in Islamic law, etc. And since the 17th century, at least, there have been women Sunni imams, those who lead the prayer and deliver the sermon, the khutbah, in China and in Central Asia. So I think lots of examples of ways in which women have been able to assert their power and agency that has been granted through the Quran.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add to that?
I would, but I see that Yasmin has joined us, so.
Hi, Yasmin. So glad that you could join us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, my system didn't cooperate with me last moment. So thank you so much once again.
We're so glad that you could join us, Yasmin.
Yeah.
So we're talking, about gender inequalities, and maybe you can kind of speak a little bit about the notion of, we were talking about the notion of what the Quran says, but if you'd like to add anything about other things as well, like structural and systemic injustices that women face today, if you'd like to add anything about that.
Yeah, sure. It's very clear that the Quranic law is the divine law, equal for both men and women, as Allah says that human being has been made from the single soul, and then we made mates, and to have generations from them, and they are created in a different way, so they are known. They know each other like in the form of tribes or in different colors or different nations. So, but the basic principle is, yes, men and women are equal in the eyes of Allah and in the religion. But yeah, I would like to add to that. Yes, principally, men and women are equal in the religion. But I will say it is a societal structure, that systemic structural systems, institutionalized systems that have created imbalances between men and women, and men has created the structured social laws to obey and subordinate and domesticate some segment of society to obey the rules and be weak and powerless and unprivileged and underprivileged to give services and be subservient to others. So this is, as we say in we talk about gender. Gender, that's why we call it, it's a social construct, and this injustices linked with that social construct, that is because of the deeply rooted patriarchal system which has been practiced for the centuries. And within this system, those weak segments are at forefront are women. Sometimes, gender is taken as equal to the differences between men and women's biology, or sometimes it is considered gender is equal to women, whereas it is not. Gender is the social laws and rules which are set by the society, by patriarchal system. And the biological differences are there indeed, and the rules do not apply on biology. Except very few exceptions, biology cannot change, but the gender is changeable over time and over in the different socio-economic settings. In a very developed country, the gender is different. In an underdeveloped and developing countries, gender is different. And looking at the principles of Islam, yes, many people, many societies who are literate, I would say, and who have that true knowledge of basic principles of Islam, and they obey and they follow. They have provided this equal opportunity to both men and women, where women have excelled their potential and have shown their excellence and their leadership role, and become the head of states and also head of the institutions. But it is not very common in every socio-economic settings or in every geographic settings. It is, the condition is, the majority is different, that majority of women and a majority of poor men, the men belong to low class minority. Someone migrated from another country, with that country is considered itself as a in the eyes of people as a low class, we can say, or based on the sexual orientation, LGBTs. There are so many who do not get that opportunity, equal opportunity to perform and excel and have that knowledge and skills to perform at that level. So because of the lack of opportunities, the majority of the women and men cannot excel and cannot perform on equal footings of leadership in religious institutions, in social institutions, and in state affairs. There are very few who excel, and there are very few who have reached to that place. But the general understanding of the different geographies and different countries and in different socio-economic settings, which prevails, is a lot of discrimination, biasness, and deprivation and oppression. And the intersectionality is an idea to look at the combined situations of the society, because if for example, if I say, as in our country, I gave examples of like bonded labor or a housemaid. Look at that housemaid. If we hire someone, the housemaid belongs to a poor family background, but at the same time she is a woman, and being a woman or belong to her poor family background is not the only reason that she does all the household chores, but at the same time she cannot sit with that rich upper class family, and she can't sit with them and eat food on the table. She has to wait for the leftover and sit in the servant quarter. So there are multiple factors which enforce and reinforce the marginalization of and oppression of the mass people, mass segment of society. So there are lots of discriminations against women, especially gender-based violence, and this gender-based violence is not happening in some particular women, with some particular women. It happens with all women, but it has different forms. With rich women, with white women, with black women, with brown women, with Eastern women, with Western women, with South Asian women, all women go through domestic violence, gender-based violence, but the forms of violence is very different at different level. So the country where we live, we have very much a tribal culture. Yes, we appreciate we had a state leader, a woman leader led Benazir Bhutto. Everybody appreciates and everybody voted for her. But at the same time, there are lots of segments who literally verdict that a woman's leadership is not allowed in Islam, whereas it is not. There is no written verdict or there is no written thing somewhere that a woman cannot be a leader. There is nothing like that in Islam, but people's perceptions, as I said, that people have interpreted because of their own understanding, they have interpreted Islamic principles in their own settings, and the language which they understand and which favors them and which gives them power to make themselves powerful and make the others powerless. So be in a privileged position. People use the name of Islam and then create discriminations and oppression and subjugations towards the weak segment of society, which at forefront is women, and then also the men belong to the poor classes, the low caste classes, and the minorities or ethnicities or LGBTs, which are not even touched by. And there are taboos to talk about certain segments in society. And there are lots of, there are lots of myths about people, and there are lots of things which we cannot even talk about. That's how, we live in the world. In Pakistan, we have very much tribal culture, though we have a variety. But let me tell you about that. This feminist movement, which started in our country, was from early 80s, when the Islamization process was started in our country. And that Islamization process itself was a subjugation and discrimination towards women. So the Rahe Amal, some of our very pioneer women started this feminist movement in Pakistan. And since then, we have many organizations working, like Roseanne and Shirkat Ga and Aurat Foundation, and there are so many others. And you may have heard about the recent Aurat March. And there were lots of criticism, and there were lots of hurdles, and there were, even stoning on women, and there were lots of violence women faced during the Aurat March. So it is just because of the oppressed situation in our country, and the discriminations towards women and girls, and also children. And the people who belong to lower caste, who are considered lower caste, and the people who are poor, who are disabled, differently able, or LGBTs, there are huge discriminations towards the people, and all these discriminations are the result of that social construct where the weak has to obey the powerful, and one has to be powerless and the other have to be powerful. So to maintain the hierarchy in society, that's how people believe in. And those women who excel, you can say they are very few in number. And we have to encourage, and we have to obviously do a lot to bring more women on that level. And we have to struggle. And this feminist movement and also the gender experts struggle hard to make people understand that this discrimination is not because of the religion or faith or any principles of any religion. Even any religion doesn't allow inequality. Any religion doesn't allow that you cannot access to education, you can't access resources, or you can't make decisions. Religion is not the foundation for inequality and discrimination. It is the people, it is the society, it is again, I will say it is the strong patriarchal system which reinforces that in the name of religion, because people have different faiths, and they are asked to listen to the people who are considered supreme in society in the name of religion.
Thank you so much for that, Yasmin. I'm so glad we got to hear you and all that you have to share with us. I would like to invite Dr. Jamal or Dr. Thobani to kind of add on to this notion a little bit about, we talked about Islam making men and women equal, right? Spiritually, materially, in all aspects. And Prophet Muhammad set that example in that society to empower women at that time. So then why are Muslim women still subordinate to men in so many places today? Can you add on to that idea, please?
Sure, I can start. So I think Yasmin did an incredible job of explaining this, that it is not Islam that oppresses women, but it is those who interpret Islam, typically for their own purposes. And historically, that has been to uphold patriarchal power. And so if you look at the context of revelation of the Quran, this is a context where women were being oppressed in many different ways. And that is why the revelation guaranteed all of these different types of rights to women. And, around that time and subsequent to the Prophet's time, it was men who were more literate, who had greater access to education, and also to opportunities for religious power or religious authority to interpret the Quran. And so because of that, they were able to interpret it in ways that upheld their own power at the expense of women. And so here you see the impact of personal agenda or local cultural mores and customs. You see, their own worldviews or political desires, etc., coming into play. And then in later years, where not everybody has learned classical Quranic Arabic, they're turning to translations of the Quran in their own languages, and oftentimes those translations, they're interpretations, right? It is difficult to translate classical Quranic Arabic into other languages. There are so many different meanings that are attributed to even individual words, and that would then change the meaning of the entire verse. And so when looking at those translations, folks may also interpret them in order to uphold the rights of some over others. And some may not even be trained at all in Quranic exegesis, but just attribute certain kinds of beliefs that they may share to the Quran and spread that among folks who also don't read the Quran as well. So we see that unfortunately happening sometimes too. I think there's also been over time, especially in the colonial period and more recently in terms of imperialist dynamics by Western states and empires to see women as objects of reform. In other words, to justify encroachment on territories where there are Muslim women and others, saying that, oh, these Muslim women, they're oppressed, they need to be saved by us. And so that then justified, political acquisition of those spaces and subjugation of entire societies to colonial and imperial powers. You also see a similar logic operating among Islamic reformers, often who have more conservative or patriarchal interpretations of Islam as well, who basically make the argument that, look, Islam had dominion over so many different places across the world, vast geographies, and we lost that power in various contestations with the West. The reason for that was that the women wrecked it for us. They were not practicing Islam appropriately or properly. So we need to bring them back in line, and we need to reform them. And so then that became a justification to, again, assert patriarchal power and to subordinate women in different ways. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I think this also points to, the fantastic and amazing work that Yasmin has dedicated her life to, which is this is why women's education and literacy and economic empowerment and political voice and participation is so important, because it enables them to assert their power and agency, to live out their God-given dignity, to be self-reliant also in responding to God's call, which is embodied in the Quran.
Okay, so I have a couple of points to make. Thank you for all of your contributions, excellent points. So the one thing I would like to pick on is, the question of what does Islam say about women? What is the status of Muslim women? Is something that is not an innocent question in contemporary moment. When it becomes the foreign policy objective of the US state to quote unquote liberate Muslim women, then we know that something else is going on in terms of asking the question around what is Islam's treatment of women, what is the status of Muslim women. So I think it's really important to see how geopolitics plays into how Islam is being represented at this particular moment. And Islam is being represented in incredibly Islamophobic manner. We're seeing a racialization of Islam. Islam is being described as a form of cultural barbarism. So I think that it's really important that we don't take this present moment for granted and think that the question about what is the status of Muslim women is an innocent question. The second thing is that Muslim communities are heterogeneous. Islam is defined in many different ways. Islam is contested by Muslims themselves. And being a Muslim is not an identity that one has forever. The Quran says that being a Muslim is an ongoing process of becoming a Muslim, right? So being a Muslim is an ongoing process, and the ethics of the faith are centered on justice, fighting zulm wherever you see it. And so what kinds of Muslims are we becoming in this particular moment is, I think, a question that's very important that needs to be tied to the question of how are members of the Muslim community treated? How is gender being reproduced in this particular way? So I think that we need to be a bit more suspicious about this question around gender and the Muslim women as a global political issue. The second thing is when we look at Muslim women as role models, and we see that as, a kind of token of some form of equality. The important question to ask is, what are these Muslim women doing? What are they doing for other women, particularly today? And we have excellent examples, but we also have very reactionary examples of Muslim women who are in positions of power. And yet, how are they using that power? That becomes a really important question for us. And I think that the point Yasmin raises about men is also very crucial, because gender doesn't only shape women's lives, it also shapes men's lives. And when we take an intersectional approach to the question of gender, sometimes we will find that women are in positions of power and privilege over men, right? Around issues of race, ethnicity, class. And so we have to interrogate this hierarchy, what we consider to be issues of gender. They are much, much wider. They have to be approached in this global manner, and they have to be approached as political questions as well as questions of faith and religion. They have to be approached as questions of economy. How is the global economy organized? What impact does that have on Muslims' practices of their own faith? Because unless we are to accept that Muslims and Muslim women are ahistorical subjects, we have to situate women, men, and Islam itself in a historical context. And we have to approach these questions and look for transformation, progressive changes, positive changes in a historicized fashion. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the concrete, to context, and to power, because these three questions are crucial to understanding how Islam is being framed, how Islam is being experienced in different societies, and how Muslim women and men's lives are being shaped in different societies.
Thank you so much for that. These are all truly amazing points. I'm learning so much and taking so many notes from you guys. With that said, I would like to know, how have your experiences, your personal experiences and your work with gender justice tried to change these structural inequalities? What are some kinds of things you guys are doing? And if you could share some examples or some stories, that would be great for us to hear your experiences and how you're trying to change this idea of gender out there. Yasmin, would you like to get us started on the work that you are doing in Pakistan?
Yeah, sure. We have been working for so long for the transformation of society, basically for gender equality. We have been working with the civil society at grassroots level and with the institutions and the religious people. And when we talk about gender or gender and development, many times in the rural settings of Pakistan, people get offended considering it is someone else's agenda. Gender equality is not our agenda, so they get offended. But then we have to explain that it is not about taking women out of the village and to somewhere else, but it is about educating both men and women and providing equal opportunity. So that's how, we did a lot of work with the communities. And the first thing when women realized that it supports them and it helps them to overcome their own subordination and their unequal status in society, they came together and they formed their women's organizations. And we have over 2,000 women's organizations as a grassroots foundation here in Gilgit-Baltistan, in Chitral, in the mountain communities of Pakistan. And also men came together to have their own forums of village men's organizations. And then they formed the supra institutions by both having equal number of men and women at the geographic level of union councils or at valley levels or at village level. They both came together and made their own rules to have 50% men and 50% women's representation in the local support organizations. So that's how, people listen to us, and we had to go through tremendous training programs and also to look at what the practical and strategic needs of both men and women are, and we have to address that. And we found that traditionally women are considered to be in a place which is more related to caring and nurturing. Going to school up to 10th grade is okay, and become a teacher is okay, and become a nurse is okay. But she can't be an engineer, and she can't be a mason or a carpenter. So these traditional and non-traditional trades, we had to bring an orientation about that a woman can play a role in any sector. And we tried our best to bring both men and women in the same sector to get trained in the technical vocational education skills, and then they performed, and the women excelled much better than men. Like they become the best carpenters, they become the best electricians, and they become the best masons, and then started hospitality for tourism. And that's how, you know, when the women shifted their trade from traditional to non-traditional, they became in the mainstream of productive sector and started earning money. And when in a poor settings, in geographic and socio-economic poor settings, when a woman has equal opportunity to earn money equal to her counterpart, her spouse, or her parents and her siblings, she gets regarded. She is acknowledged because she contributes to the family as a bread earner. So when people saw that these women are learning skills and they are earning good money, then there was an encouragement, and a change started within society. And as I quote every time, that there was only a concept of having a one woman's shop, ladies shop in a corner with few items. But when these women got trained in entrepreneurship as a non-traditional trade, they initiated to open up huge markets which are run only by women. And there was some criticism from some conservative people, and also from some of the religious leaders. And when we did negotiate with them, they came up with the solution that these women-only markets should be run only by women, and also the producers and the buyers should also be only women, so that it will be a world of women only. Well, anyway, that was the beginning to bring women into productive sector was welcome. So that's how, you know, today when we see in Gilgit-Baltistan, Chitral, a huge markets are run by women, and women are in the business. Women have got access to mobility because of these interventions. They travel long distances. They make their own decisions. They make choices for which items to bring and how much money to spend. There are no cash transactions. So they become empowered and they have decision-making role. And that's how when we see in society, in small villages, those women who are earning good money, they have a status, they have a position, and they are powerful. They are invited at all forums. Whenever there is a decision-making forum, there is a kind of community work or public work, and they are invited to the meetings because they know that these women are empowered. They travel alone, they earn money, they are into business, and they have more understanding than the women who are sitting inside home. So that's how, you know, this economic empowerment has also brought change in the lives of women. So these are some examples I would like to share. So that's how, you know, it is very important to bring women into the mainstream development, engage in non-traditional productive sector, and provide equal opportunity. And also we had a very low women's literacy 20 years back. It was hardly 6 to 7%. But when we initiated this adult literacy program for girls and also for adult women, over 20,000 women became literate, and they were able to read a newspaper and write a letter to their dear ones. So they were counted into the regional literacy, and the literacy ratio of women increased into 13%. So that was a huge contribution, and those women, they become empowered because they can now read and write. and now they can count the money, they can do the transactions. So, you know, it's all about the equality is all about providing equal opportunity. If one doesn't get opportunity, they are in a marginalized or discriminated position, powerless, and those people face more inequalities, and they face more injustices in life than those men and women who are more aware of and who have exposure and who know about their rights and who know where to access if they have any issue.
So I can say a little bit about my approach and about my work. So the first thing is, you know, in my work, I really interrogate the idea of equality. Yeah, equality in what? And we are actually in a moment of crisis where the economy is unsustainable. The environmental crisis is going to have devastating consequences, already is having devastating consequences. And so when we think about equality, we really have to ask the question, equality in what? In what kind of system? In an unsustainable system that is in a deep moment of crisis. The COVID pandemic has only, shown us very clearly how fragile our societies are, how fragile life itself has become. So I think that, you know, in my work, I spend a lot of time actually interrogating this idea of equality. Equality in what? And that means that, you know, I am very deeply committed to a politics of transformation. These institutions, these structures have to be transformed. And in thinking about positive transformation, what kind of changes are now even possible, it's really important to have an intersectional approach. Now, intersectionality, Yasmin, you mentioned it, and I'm very glad you did. Intersectionality is a concept that comes from Black feminist theory. And intersectionality is the idea that we cannot give gender primacy. Gender is not the primary social relation that organizes society, that race, colonialism, ethnicity, sexuality, these are just as crucial in shaping the experience of gender, in shaping women's lives. So intersectionality means that we really have to pay attention to how there are hierarchies of power inside our own community, inside every community, and, you know, acknowledge what those forms of inequality are, what those forms of power imbalance are, and then try and build common projects of change. And in my work in the women's movement, you know, building coalitions with women from other communities is crucial to bringing about changes in social institutions, in law, in immigration policy, the anti-war movement, for example. So building coalitions which actually acknowledge and center upfront what are the power inequalities amongst the communities that are getting together in this particular project to build a kind of common agenda. So building coalition is very, very important because our community has to be able to work with other communities, whether it is in Canada, whether it is in the US or Pakistan, anywhere in the world. Our community has to be much more much more preemptive in building coalitions that are sustainable with people who are struggling for issues that we are struggling for as well. And to me, what's really important is we really understand the space we're in. We live in a settler colonial society where the oppression, colonization of indigenous peoples is ongoing. How do we come to terms with our own location here in a way that actually gives solidarity to indigenous people rather than seeking equality in Canadian institutions, which are white supremacist institutions? So in a way, you know, we are really in a very perilous moment, I feel. We are in a global crisis. Muslim women in particular are in a great position of peril, because on the one hand, you have the biggest imperialist powers in the planet using the status of Muslim women to justify invasions, occupations, wars, which is leading to mass displacement. Millions have been killed. The impact on women of trying to keep communities together, families together under these conditions are really, impossible when you try and think of what women try to accomplish under these conditions. So to really understand what is the political moment we're in, and it's a moment of great peril for Muslim women. On the one hand, you're being used as a power play between these imperialist superpowers. On the other hand, there are real issues of inequality, violence, structural, systemic. How do you actually negotiate those without feeding all the Islamophobic constructs that are already out there about Islam? So I think that, it's a real moment of crisis. And I think as a community, we have to approach this as a moment of crisis.
So I'm happy to chime in now too. I just have to say that it is very humbling to be on this panel with these two powerhouse women, and I'm just so tickled that I have the opportunity to sit alongside of you. I am a cultural anthropologist, and so I waffle between trying to understand the structures of power at institutional levels, be they local, national, and global, and then also working on the ground with different folks. And so I have done some projects in Central Asia, so food security issues in Tajikistan, where women are largely the farmers, but it is the young boys and the older men who are left behind who are getting access to education and resources of how to do that farming in a contemporary context. Also working on women's entrepreneurship for founding small and medium businesses in Kyrgyzstan, and then also working on issues of polygamy in Central Asia as well. And what I found very much like my counterparts, Sunera and Yasmin, is that working on the ground with women is one thing, but you also need to have an ear to the ground in understanding the position of the children, of the husbands and the other men in society, of the in-laws, and listening to everyone's perspectives and experiences, valuing and validating them, and then finding common causes or common concerns that they share, and the different motivators that will get them to achieve that common cause. So oftentimes, what I found was arguing along the lines of, hey, there are broader interpretations of scripture. It doesn't necessarily sit well with everybody, or they may feel sidelined or attacked in some way. And so that doesn't get you very far. But if you talk along the lines, for example, of how is this going to enhance the quality of life for the family or the extended family, the tribe or the village, etc., a lot of folks don't necessarily have access to enough resources, enough financial resources, or electricity or food or shelter, etc. So by arguing along those lines, you can say, look, involving women in their education to enhance food security for this country, or engaging women as entrepreneurs in this country is really going to help everybody. And so I think, contextualizing those approaches to the local cultural settings where you're working and engaging all of these different stakeholders, regardless of gender, age, status, etc., position in society, I think is very, very important. In the US context, I've worked on issues of the mental health impacts of Islamophobia and also abuse in migrant populations, so very much mirroring some of the points that Sunera was talking about, that there are challenges within the Muslim society itself, and then also impacts from the outside because of the war on terror, other geopolitics, etc. And these are public health crises if they continue to perpetuate at the rate that they're going. And it's not specific to Muslim women. You find this in other populations as well, intersectional and otherwise. And again, I think, as Sunera was saying, there's a deep importance of, listening to those stories, having these support groups for women to be able to come together and understand one another, building these coalitions across race and religion and orientation and status, et cetera, to again address these common cause issues and systemic injustices. So, for example, if you look at the Women's March in the United States and the Me Too movement, both of which became these global movements, one of the founders was a Muslim woman who, joined hands with other women to say, look, there are certain things that we need to advocate for in society generally that are not specific to Islam alone, but that, more broadly speaking, need to be marked. And, as the women's movement grew, we also saw that there were slippages and contentions and contestations within the movement as well, which I think very beautifully shows that there are multiple expressions of feminism, multiple interpretations of what it means to be equitable or equal in society. And you do have some women who have, more illiberal interpretations of those concepts, which may not sit well with everybody. But at the same time, are you going to exclude them, or are you going to say that, okay, these are women who have been duped into the patriarchy? Then that's taking away their agency if that is earnestly the way in which they have identified themselves and their interpretation of their position in society. So I think that we need to take a broader position in how we negotiate these conversations and then figure out these transformative ways forward to be more equitable for all peoples, regardless of gender or other identity marker.
Thank you so much to the panelists for those very powerful and concrete examples that you have given us, and lots of things to think about. With that, I do want to turn to some audience questions that have been coming in. So I'd like to begin with this first one. In light of context and space, it's fair to say that what gender justice or gendered inequity looks different depending on where you are, the cultural patterns, and political and structures of society. If we look to the Western world, what does gender equity look like or work like?
So, shall I take a stab at that question?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. So, if we look at Western society, what we see is that, even as I think that Western culture itself is being redefined at the moment through this kind of construction of Islam as the other, as the enemy other, is in very Islamophobic terms. And so Western culture is now redefining itself as woman-friendly, gender-friendly, queer-friendly, as committed to gender and sexual egalitarianism. So we've seen a shift in how Western culture is being redefined by Westerners in this particular moment, and it's being done through the demonization of Islam and by projecting onto Islam gender, sexual violence, misogyny, homophobia, all of that stuff. So we're seeing Western culture being redefined, and white feminists, Western feminists have played a key role in allowing feminism to be re-articulated in these kinds of Western terms. So what we see Western feminists doing at the moment is colluding with this idea that somehow gender equality is a uniquely Western value, yeah? And, I mentioned earlier this kind of the foreign policy objective of saving Muslim women. George Bush was the one who introduced that. Obama was committed to that. Hillary Clinton was committed to that. Within Western feminist movements, we now have the idea of feminist foreign policy, which again centers gender in this particular kind of way. So when we look at Western culture, I think it's really important to look at what feminism looks like today. And Western feminism actually is the ideology in which imperialism and imperialist wars are being organized today. So I think it's really important that as women of color, as people of color, as Muslims who have been racialized, that we be very clear-sighted about what we mean when we talk about feminism, when we talk about Western culture, because there is such a deep tendency, and there are historical reasons for that, for many sectors of our community to be completely white identified. to want to, equality in terms of, whether it's Canadian nationalism or US nationalism or what have you. And, it's part of, the kind of colonial dynamics. We still live in a kind of a status of coloniality. And the way this politics plays out in our community is a total identification with whiteness, with Western society. Westernizing ourselves is seen as a very kind of modern thing to do, very important. And what we don't see is how, in the way that Western culture is being articulated, including Western feminism, is actually a process that is deepening the colonization of Muslims around the world. So I think that is a very good question to ask about how is Western culture dealing with the issues of gender and sexuality. And this is a moment of change where, Western imperialist neoconservatives are using feminism, sexual, gender egalitarianism to actually justify a process of recolonization of Muslim countries, Muslim societies, Muslim communities, even of those of us who live inside the West.
Thank you. Anybody care to add anything, or should we move to the next question?
I'm just curious to ask Sunera, what do you think we can do to address that? So in part, I think what you're pointing to is that, some of us may have chosen to colonize our own minds with a specific instantiation of Western feminism, which is detrimental perhaps to our own faith-based identity. So what do we do? What are the options here?
Well, the options are, I think we really have to know what our own history and what our historical experience has been. And this is not something that we know very well. This is not something, I teach students from our communities. They are excellent students, brilliant students. They have no knowledge of the history of our community. They have no knowledge of what our community has gone through in coming to Canada. They have no knowledge of settler colonialism. So I think it's really important that our institutions have to actually live up to the challenges of the times. And that means make resources available, educate in our community about our own histories, because those are written out. The history of Ismaili women, you won't find that in any feminist text, right? So, in a way, that space has to be opened up inside our community for these conversations to be had. And my own experience has been that those amongst our young people who are, have more challenging views are actually ostracized. They're pushed outside of the community. And so they end up working in mainstream organizations, in mixed group organizations, but not inside our community, because there's no space for this kind of critical thinking, this kind of critical evaluation of our experience, of what kind of future do we envision for our community, for our youth. And, this moment, I've called it a moment of crisis. I don't think anybody can argue against that, is that the young people in our community are participating in Black Lives Matter. They are participating in pride events. They are, and they are actually have a wealth of experience and knowledge from this work that they're doing. But this work is not taking place inside the community. So I think that this is a real kind of wake-up call for institutions inside our community. And, I think it's really important to see that, the way colonization worked, and I don't see colonization as past, right? I see us as living in a condition of coloniality. The way colonization has worked is actually colonizing the mind, right? Ngugi Thiong'o's work, right? Decolonizing the mind. And so how have our minds been colonized and directed toward Western society, towards Westernity as our future, right? And I think that break needs to happen. And I think that can only happen through developing anti-racist and anti-colonial critical perspectives. Those are crucial, right? And I think, this again brings me back to the question of Muslim women. Muslim women have been colonized for centuries now, right? So what impact has that had on how Muslim women, how we live our lives, how we even understand our faith, right? So, these are very deep questions. Islam has not remained untouched through processes of Western colonization. So what has the impact been on Islam, on Muslim communities, on our relationship to Islam, right? What does it mean when we define Islam as a faith, as unconnected to issues around this worldly issues, right? Which is how Western culture treats faith, right? It's to do with the other world. It's not to do with this world. When, you know, the crucial kind of cry of Islam, the claim of Islam is social justice, is justice in this world. That is what founded Islam. Islam became Islam because the first people who converted as Muslims were people who were disenfranchised, who were dispossessed, slaves converted to Islam, women, orphans. If you look at the Prophet's own actions, women, orphans, widows, these are at the center of his concerns. What is that if not concern with gender, right? And so gender, race, I mean, I don't, you know, these are very complicated questions and I don't mean to trivialize them, but we really need to rethink our connection to our faith by also paying attention to our experience as historical subjects who have lived through colonization and who are now in North America living in a place where other communities are, their colonization is ongoing, indigenous peoples. So, you know, what does our future here look like if we were in communication and in coalition with indigenous peoples? Right? But we have been so fixated, and this is true of most immigrant communities, so fixated on getting equality with existing institutions, which are institutions genocidal in the case of US and Canada. If we look at indigenous people, these are citizenship in Canada is defined by indigenous peoples as the final solution, right? It's the final solution to destroying indigeneity, assimilation into Canadianness, right? And Canadianness, we know, is defined as whiteness, right? British and French, that's who found it. Cultures, official languages are British and French. So we really have to be much more critical, both in kind of institutional life within our community, but also how we engage with these larger institutional structures. And I don't think that there is any easy answer to this, but I do know that if we don't pay attention to history, to context and power, then we can't, you know, we are kind of fighting a losing battle, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next question is about Sunera, Dr. Sunera, sorry. You mentioned that you know, there are these projects from the West, right, to the barbaric and sort of less developed world, and that's what they're trying to do when they're addressing Muslim women over there. But also looking at within these countries as well, Muslims are considered immigrants, they are undermined, and they're often seen as projects within their own countries. So what are some patterns that we see that are being hooked onto when it comes to inequity and oppression of women? What are some patterns that we're able to see, and what are some things we can do about it as well? Yasmin, would you like to kind of start us off with this one?
Can you please repeat the question, because I didn't hear properly.
That's okay, I can do that. So I think it was mentioned that there are Muslims themselves within a lot of these countries are considered immigrants and are seen as projects, right? And so what patterns do we see that are applied to women when it comes to inequity and oppression of women in less developed countries?
Yeah, a very relevant question. Exactly, for women, even if they themselves are immigrants, the inequities and injustices already prevail. But on top of that, if these are women, the injustices increase, and they will be put in a difficult situation, and it's a kind of the way we were talking about the mindset of the colonization, that they are coming from a different country and they are immigrants and they are considered as a project. on one hand, there are lots of expectations from them to deliver. And on the other hand, because they are women, so obviously there will be discrimination and marginalization, and they will not be able to perform the way they will be having an intention to perform in such a setting.
Thank you for that,
If I answered properly, because I didn't get your voice clearly. So
no, I think you answered it very well. Thank you so much for that. With that, I'm going to turn to our last question. So we kind of want to look to the future now, and kind of end it on a positive note. So with this, I want to ask, what are the current dynamics in Islam that gives us hope, or that can guide us towards realizing the exalted views about women's equality in our society? How do we go forward from today? What advice can you give us about, and practical steps has been asked specifically, about how to move forward and to create this gender equity? Dr. Jamal, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think a few things are useful here. I think as has been mentioned, understanding our own history and both of our faith and of our of this historical moment, how we got here as subjects. I think understanding also the root causes of the inequities and addressing those in a multi-input fashion. And then lastly, also engaging all of the different stakeholders in that process. So you can't have movements towards justice and equity if there are, small groups that are involved in those processes of transformation. You need to have broader coalitions that include all people. And so that's the hard work, right? Is to get that buy-in and then to figure out, what is going to motivate people to come together on those issues. So, for example, if you look at the history of race relations in the United States, you have seen examples of a Klansman and a civil rights leader come together on common cause issues once they sat down and humanized one another. Right. That's, for example, what this movie Best of Enemies shows us. Right. It's a true story. And so you can see that it is possible. It just needs to happen on a broader scale. And I think that's the unique challenge here. And the opportunity is also that, okay, with social media, this is a possibility. The unfortunate reality is that with the 24/7 news cycle and, social media oftentimes has been used to divide us all in these ideological ways rather than bring us together. But it does possess that ability. And so how is it that we can leverage that to find ways to come together on some common cause issues and move towards positive change? It's challenging. It's a tall order, I know, but I think that it's possible.
So I would say that, we're living through a moment of crisis, but we're also living through a moment where radical changes are possible and they've been put on the agenda. If we look at what the Black Lives Matter movement has accomplished and how centrally it has put the question of race on national agendas everywhere and also on the international agendas, I think it's hugely inspiring. I think this is something that we need to learn about, to connect with. I know that young people from our community have been involved in organizing the demonstrations, but to bring that back into the community, I think that's really important. So, the changes that are taking place like right now, the environmentalist movement, for example, is really an important movement as well. How do we connect to it? How do we learn about it? How do we actually make our perspectives heard in those movements? So I see this, as all kinds of things have now become suddenly possible. And I think that it's really important that we work together with other communities. I think after 9/11 and with the invasion of Afghanistan, there was a moment when Muslims were completely ostracized, right? And there are, again, many reasons for this. And many of the previous coalitions that had existed amongst women of color, for example, splintered because Muslims were racialized and constructed as terrorists, certainly by the states, but also within mainstream society and within movements. But I think that has really shifted right now. And it's shifted because of the resistance of Muslim women. And so I think that there are new openings, new possibilities to try and think about how Islamophobia, for example, connects to anti-Black racism, right? How does the indigenous resurgence that has taken over North American politics, how does that connect to our vision of our future here? So I think that, learning, thinking about this, drawing on resources that are now, abundantly available at the moment. I mean, these possibilities will shut down, but making connections with the resources that are being produced by Black Lives Matters, for example, and bringing them into our community, and finding ways to connect with people who are on the front line of many of these struggles against racism, against environmental collapse, and bringing that also back into the community, so that it's not those of us who go out of the community who get involved in it, and then there's no space to bring that back into the community. And I think that young people in our community, I mean, it's a huge source of inspiration for me.
Thank you so much. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you so much to our speakers. This has been an amazing panel, and it's just been so great to hear all of you and all the insights that you have with all the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us on this Sunday, and hopefully we've given you lots to think about as you leave today. I have a couple announcements before everyone leaves. We have some resources that our panelists have put together for us very kindly, and we will be emailing this out to you as if you attended today. So please look out for an email for that. Also, ITREB USA is presenting Aspire, a stronger future built on the foundations of our faith. Join lawyer-author Dr. Mohammed Keshevji to explore unique insights on the struggle against social injustices in South and East Africa, culminating in political independence on both of these regions in the second half of the 20th century on Thursday, July 23rd at 8 p.m. CST. There's a link that we will share in the chat with you guys. If you want to, you can register with that link. There are also young adult conversations happening this week that will unpack this notion of gender equity, so please look out for information on that. Next Sunday, our critical conversation will be on the topic of social justice and Islam, exploring global poverty. Please look out for more information on the Smiley USA webpage and social media pages, so you can register and join us next week as well. There is a survey that will pop out at the end of the session on your screen. Before you leave, please take that so we can get great feedback on how to move forward with these critical conversations. Thank you so much for joining us again, to the panelists and the audience. Thank you, and Yali Madat.